The Young and the Restless Spoilers. Ian Ward's shadow returned to Genoa City like a nightmare that everyone thought had been buried, but this time he did not come back with the sly, sermonizing smile of a manipulative cult leader. He came with a brutal, hardened exterior, the look of a man who had spent too long in darkness and no longer had the patience to pretend to be anything other than dangerous. The lines on his face were deeper, etched by years of running and plotting, and his eyes carried a hollow exhaustion that only made the flashes of madness in them more terrifying. The fragile sense of calm that had slowly settled over Genoa City fractured the moment his name appeared again in police reports and whispered conversations. Sharon felt it in the tightening of her chest as she watched information cross her desk. Abby sensed it in the sudden and natural silence in the Chancellor Mansion where Dominic's laughter had once echoed. Devon heard it in the way his phone rang and rang with no comforting update. And everyone who had ever crossed paths with Ian understood one simple truth: a man like him never resurfaced without a plan. His return demanded extreme caution because the danger he represented was never just about violence. It was about the twisted psychology that let him bend people to his will and make them doubt their own reality. Yet this time, beneath the familiar menace, there was something new driving him, something he spoke about with the fervor of obsession rather than simple revenge. The need to find the daughter who had been taken from him, the child he believed the world had stolen and hidden, the living proof that his influence and bloodline had not been completely erased. Far away from the safety of the Chancellor estate, in a hidden place that bore no trace of warmth or comfort, Dominic was held captive in a world no child should ever have to experience. There were no soft blankets that smelled like home, no gentle lullabies, no familiar arms to soothe his cries, only cold walls, dim lighting, and the constant tension that vibrated in the air like a silent alarm. The boy gradually became more stubborn, his defiance not just the tantrums of a difficult child, but the raw, instinctive rebellion of someone whose sense of safety had been ripped away. He refused to eat, refused to sleep properly, screamed when anyone tried to approach him, especially when he heard the heavy footsteps that announced Ian's presence. Dominic did not have the vocabulary to understand words like kidnapping or cult, but he understood fear, and his small body reacted to it with every fiber of resistance he had. Mariah, trapped in the middle of this nightmare, oscillated between terror, guilt, and confusion. She had once convinced herself that taking Dominic away would protect him from a world that had so often harmed her. That a child raised under her watchful eye would never feel as abandoned and broken as she had. Ian saw that vulnerability and exploited it, twisting her fears into justification, making her believe that extracting Dominic from his life was somehow a warped act of love. But as days went by and she watched Dominic withdraw and fight back, Mariah began to see that whatever she had told herself about this situation, the reality was that the boy she cared for was being used as a pawn in a larger, darker game. She listened to Ian talk and realized that for him, Dominic was not the end goal. He was leverage, bait, a tool to lure other people into his narrative. The real obsession at the core of Ian's mind was his lost daughter, the child he believed he had a divine right to claim, no matter what the cost. Ian spoke of that daughter often, his tone a disturbing mixture of wounded pride, religious zeal, and unshaken entitlement. He described her not as a person, but as a concept, a symbol of what he believed he could mold a human soul into if given full control, a true successor to his philosophy of mind control, spiritual manipulation, and psychological domination. In his memory, she was forever frozen as a crying infant ripped from his world by authorities, lawyers, and those he saw as enemies of his truth. When he looked at Dominic, he did not see an innocent child. He saw proof that the system still allowed people to take children and brainwash them with their own values instead of his. Mariah watched the way his eyes drifted when he spoke about the past, how they went far beyond the walls of their hiding place, back to a time when a young woman in his cult had turned against him, fled with their baby, and used the legal system and secrecy to keep that child out of his reach. He had never forgiven the world for that, and he had never stopped searching. His anger was not the rage of a grieving father, it was the fury of a man who felt his ownership had been violated. Dominic, in this warped view, was a hostage taken in advance of a greater negotiation. The true prize, the true fixation, was the daughter Ian believed was somewhere out there, her identity hidden behind altered records, fake names, and buried files. While Ian fed his obsession in the shadows, life in Genoa City tried to move forward, though tension hung in the air like a storm that refused to break. Sienna, unaware that a ghost from the past had begun circling her world, was focused on building something that, for once, felt like genuine happiness. With Noah by her side, she allowed herself to dream about a future that was not entirely dictated by fear or shame. Noah, with his gentle patience and quiet strength, represented a kind of safe harbor she had rarely known. With him, she could laugh without always looking over her shoulder, could share hopes without immediately undercutting them with pessimism. Yet even in her happiest moments, there were cracks, small, jagged shadows of questions she had never been able to answer. She did not know her father's face. Any time she had tried as a child to ask about him, the adults in her life had changed the subject, their voices turning stiff, their eyes sliding away. She had a handful of fragmented memories, a room lit by candles where people sat in a circle, a deep male voice talking about light and freedom, a large hand gripping her arm when she tried to move, distant shouting turning into sudden silence. She had been told a simple story as she grew up that her father was gone, that he had been a mistake, that she was better off never knowing him. On some level, Sienna had accepted that narrative because it hurt less than wondering what she might have lost. But sometimes she would catch her own reflection in the mirror and feel unsettled, as if her eyes held a history she had never been allowed to read. Noah saw those unspoken questions in her, but he respected her boundaries. He knew she carried scars from relationships that had twisted love into a weapon, that she had survived situations where trust had been manipulated into control. He did not want to become another person who pushed her into places she was not ready to go. Still, when news broke that Dominic had been kidnapped and the name Ian Ward began circulating again, a new tension spread through the Newman family. For those who remembered, Ian was not just a criminal. He was a symbol of how deeply psychological abuse could cut. Sharon felt her skin prickle every time his name was mentioned, as if the old terror of being inside his web had never fully faded. When she heard faint rumors that Ian used to talk about a child he had lost, the daughter taken by corrupt forces, her thoughts began to spiral in a direction that terrified her. She connected that obsession to the kidnapping of Dominic, to Mariah's fragile mental state, and then, unavoidably, to Sienna's vague and suppressed history. A chilling possibility took shape. What if the daughter Ian had been hunting all these years was not just a faceless name, but someone already living among them? Someone with gaps in her past and scars she could not explain. Driven by both fear and responsibility, Sharon started digging. Along with Michael and other allies, she revisited old files, court orders, sealed adoption records, and documents tied to the dismantling of Ian's former cult. Many files were heavily redacted, altered, or hidden through legal maneuvers designed to protect vulnerable victims. Yet, buried among them, they stumbled upon a packet of paperwork that bore details too familiar to ignore. It concerned a baby girl born to a woman who had once been part of Ian's group, a woman who later cooperated with authorities to escape his grip. The file listed a birthplace, a date, and, most critically, a medical note about a small birthmark on the child's left shoulder. The father's name field was left blank at the mother's insistence, an intentional move to keep Ian from making a legal claim. When Sharon reread the description of that birthmark, her mind instantly conjured up the image of Sienna in a tank top. The faint but distinct mark on her shoulder that had always seemed like just another ordinary detail. Suddenly it was not ordinary at all. The convergence of dates, places, and physical details was too specific. This was no longer a theory built on hunches, it was a line of evidence pointing toward a truth nobody wanted. Sienna might be Ian Ward's missing daughter. Once that realization took hold in the inner circle of people who knew, everything shifted, even if no one had said anything to Sienna yet. The way Sharon looked at her changed, softening with sympathy but sharpening with wary protectiveness. Noah, though still deeply in love with her, grew quieter whenever the topic of family or past trauma surfaced, as if he was carrying a weight he did not know how to share. Sienna herself sensed a strange new energy in the room whenever she walked in, a subtle tension that prickled at the edges of her peace. Her dreams, which had already been unsettled by the stress of past events, turned darker. Faces she could not clearly remember floated to the surface of her subconscious, distant voices chanting words about destiny and purpose, a tall silhouette watching her from the edge of a crowd. The name Ian Ward, once meaningless to her, began to appear more frequently in whispers, in half-overheard conversations, and the strained way people reacted to certain news stories. The idea that this man might be connected to her in any way made her stomach twist, because if it were true, then everything she had been told about her father being irrelevant and better forgotten was not just a simplification, it was a shield against something monstrous. Meanwhile, in his hideout, Ian was engaged in his own grotesque form of research. He had always hoarded information, especially anything touching on the daughter, who had been taken from him years ago. In a battered box tucked away in a corner, he kept his relics, a faded baby blanket, a tiny bracelet, a blurred photograph of a young woman clutching a baby with desperate fear in her eyes. Each object fueled his belief that he had been robbed, not corrected. He never acknowledged his abuses. In his mind, the world had wronged him, not the other way around. When he caught rumors, through illegal channels and illicit surveillance, of a woman named Sienna whose background was suspiciously fragmented and whose adoption history was far from straightforward, something inside him latched onto the name. He dug deeper, hacking into records, bribing people, decoding redactions. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that he had found the trail he thought had gone cold forever. He noted the year of her birth, the inconsistencies in her paperwork, the gaps where a father's information should have been, and a growing certainty hardened into obsession. He began to talk about destiny again, about blood calling to blood, and it became increasingly clear that while Dominic's kidnapping was causing chaos for others, for Ian it was just part of a larger drama in which he intended to make a triumphant entrance as a wronged father reclaiming what was his. Mariah, watching him spiral deeper into this delusion, felt herself being pulled into directions at once. On one side was her deep, complicated attachment to Dominic and the irrational belief that being with her somehow protected him from a world that had never been kind to her. On the other side was the stark reality that she had enabled a dangerous man to use that child as a bargaining chip. She knew what it meant to grow up feeling like a piece in someone else's scheme, to be manipulated under the guise of love and guidance. The thought that Sienna might soon be dragged into the same sort of sick dynamic, this time under the label of daughter instead of follower, made her stomach churn. She imagined Sienna being confronted by Ian, her identity thrown into chaos, her hard-won stability shattered. Mariah began to understand that if she continued to do nothing, she would be partly responsible for a tragedy that stretched beyond Dominic. Ian's quest for his daughter was not a father's search for reconciliation. It was a predator tracking down a prey he believed belonged in his cage. Sharon found herself facing a brutal dilemma. Keeping the truth or even the suspicion about Sienna's parentage hidden might spare her, for a little while, from a devastating emotional blow. But if Ian was already moving toward her, using Dominic and Mariah as a lure, then ignorance would not be protection, it would be a vulnerability. Sharon had lived through enough secrets and DNA shocks to know that lies, even well-intentioned, often lead to deeper ruin. She replayed in her mind all the times people had tried to shield her from the truth only for it to explode later with far greater force. She imagined Sienna discovering the connection to Ian not from someone who loved her, but from Ian himself, in some twisted performance where he presented himself as the only one who really understood her destiny. That scenario was unacceptable. So Sharon began to prepare herself for a conversation she dreaded. She would have to sit down with Sienna and tell her that there were strong reasons to believe her biological father was not just some faceless stranger, but the man currently at the center of a kidnapping, a man whose name was synonymous with manipulation and cruelty. When that conversation finally happened, it cracked Sienna's world open. Hearing Ian's name framed as a likely part of her own bloodline felt like being pushed to the edge of a cliff she had never known she was standing on. As Sharon softly laid out the evidence, the sealed records, the matching birth date and birthplace, the deliberate omission of the father's name, the medical note about the birthmark on her shoulder, Sienna's mind began scrambling through her past. Memories she had kept hazy on purpose suddenly sharpened with cruel clarity. A room full of strangers sitting in a circle, all watching a man at the center speak with an intensity that frightened her even when she was too young to understand the words. The feeling of being pulled away from that place while someone shouted behind her, the burning sensation of being told never to speak of any of it again. The knowledge that the man in those half-forgotten scenes might be the same monster now holding a child hostage was almost too much to process. And yet, beneath the horror, another fear whispered, if he was her father, then what did that say about her? What did it mean to carry the blood of someone capable of such evil? That question sliced through her sense of self like a blade. For years, Sienna had been trying to reinvent herself, to move beyond the mistakes and traumas of her past. To prove to herself most of all that she was not permanently defined by what had been done to her or by the damage she had once caused others. Now she was being told that the darkness might not just be outside of her, but also inside her, woven into her DNA. Rationally, she knew that blood does not dictate morality, that people are more than their parentage, but logic is fragile when confronted with the fear of inheriting a monster's legacy. She thought of Noah, of how he saw her, of the trust he had placed in her. She wondered if he would look at her differently now, if the revelation of her possible connection to Y&R would change the way he touched her, held her, promised her a future. The idea that her very identity might become a source of fear for the people she loved made her want to retreat, to disappear, to run before they had a chance to pull away from her. All the while, the central question loomed over everyone: what would happen if Ian and Sienna were ever face to face? They had no shared memories in any conscious sense. She did not recognize his voice. He had not seen her since she was an infant, but trauma cuts deep grooves in the human psyche. Perhaps there would be nothing more than awkward silence, a vague unease. Or perhaps something older and more instinctive would spark, some unsettling sense of familiarity in the way he looked at her, in the cadence of his speech, and the invasive intensity of his gaze. Ian believed in signs and symbols. If he saw anything in her that reminded him of his own younger self or of the woman who had once borne his child, he would seize on it as proof. Sienna feared looking into his eyes and seeing some distorted reflection of her own inner darkness staring back at her, confirming her worst fears that she was more like him than she wanted to admit. That possibility was terrifying enough to make her want to run, yet the thought of Dominic, a child already caught in his clutches, made her feel equally sick at the idea of doing nothing. At the heart of all this, Dominic remained a little boy who could not understand why the world had suddenly become so cold and frightening. His stubbornness, his refusal to comply, were not just behavioral problems, they were survival responses. Every time he pushed a plate away, every time he refused to answer when spoken to, every time he screamed when Ian drew near, he was asserting the only control he had left. For the adults around him, his behavior was a mirror, reflecting everything wrong with the situation. A child who had once felt safe now saw everyone as a potential threat. Dominic became the silent judge of their choices. For Mariah, every tear he shed was an accusation. You let this happen. For Sharon, every sign of distress was a reminder of how quickly innocence could be shattered. For Abby and Devon, every hour without him was a text written in pain across their hearts. You failed to protect him. And for Sienna, who had once been a child used and shaped by forces she did not understand, Dominic symbolized the line she did not want history to cross again. So the story of Ian's return was never just about a villain resurfacing. It was about the collision between past and present, between blood ties and moral choice, between the lies told to protect and the truths that might break people but also set them free. Ian came back with a brutal appearance and a defiant posture, but inside he was still the same man who believed he was entitled to own other people's lives, especially those connected to him by blood or by trauma. Sienna stood on the brink of a revelation that could either destroy her or strengthen her resolve to define herself against the darkness she had inherited. Mariah hovered between complicity and redemption, trying to find the courage to break away from a pattern of letting fear dictate her actions. Dominic waited, small and frightened, at the center of a storm he had never asked to be part of. And hovering over all of them was the question that every soul in Genoa City had to confront in one way or another: are we defined by where we come from, by the wounds we've received, or by the choices we make when the shadows of our past rise up and demand that we bow to them again? The answer had not yet been written, but with every decision, every confession, every confrontation that lay ahead, they would etch it slowly into the fabric of their lives. proving whether Ian Ward's return would be the beginning of a new reign of terror or the final chapter in a nightmare that should have ended long ago.